Well, John, why don't we jump right in? I'd love to start with the part of your journey that led to philanthropy. So at what point in your career did you start thinking about giving away money?
Yeah, so I started in kind of financial markets when I was 21 years old, right out of college. And by kind of age 25, 26, was starting to do pretty well and thinking about, I want to give back, but had no idea what that actually meant. So I remember being in a supermarket and seeing this magazine that was the top 200 nonprofits in America. And I just picked it up, went home, and there was one of the nonprofits listed was a charter school network in Houston, where I lived. And so I'm gonna call them up and go visit them, and that started my journey kind of 25 years in kind of ed reform movement and trying to figure out kind of what my beliefs were about K-12, what kind of the theory of change was, and also thinking about, programs versus policy. And, a lot was being thrown against the wall on K-12 back then. Things like small schools and teacher training and principal training and new curriculums. And so that was all what I'd call on the programmatic side. And then there was, what are the policies that come from government about how schools are funded, which schools are open, which schools are closed. And so that started this long journey of thinking about programs versus policies that then kind of continued out through my philanthropic career to today.
There's an element of, you call it deep thinking, that goes into that. When you first say, oh, I see a magazine, this charity is nearby, to maybe I want to give them some money, to are they doing things well, to how do you make things better? At what point in time did you progress in that journey, or did you just start immediately saying, well, if I'm going to give them $1, I better figure out what works?
Yeah, in some ways, giving is similar to business and kind of business principles, especially kind of as a capital allocator. Think about, what area do you want to be invested in, and then within that area, who do you choose, right? And then setting up KPIs and evaluations. And so that part I think is similar on that, looking at things through a business lens. But then there are a lot of differences. And one of them is that metrics are much harder in a lot of the nonprofit sector. And the feedback loop is much longer. So in the business world, it's about profits or a proxy for profits like revenue growth and market share and margin expansion. In the nonprofit sector, number one, the data is not very good, and it's hard to get, and you're not even sure if you're measuring the thing that matters. And so there's this kind of a tension between trying to be quantitative and qualitative in the evaluation of what's working. And again, when you're sitting there at year 2, should I renew with this organization? And you don't really know yet, because a lot of these things, again, have these long feedback cycles. And so that's where I think this, part of this is a qualitative measure of, do I feel like this organization is doing well?
As you thought about, or as you think today about your giving strategy, how did you take that instant feedback loop from trading, understanding business, and saying, okay, there's a less clear metrics, and put it into a process for how you started thinking about your own philanthropy?
I think in both we're looking for leverage, right? And so it's when you're investing, it's what is your edge? Where can you have leverage in the markets? And I think anybody who's giving money wants to get the most out of that dollar, right? And so we started thinking about leverage as well, and this kind of goes back to this programs versus policy. And I think as an investor, you think about where's their green space, where are other people not focused on, and so kind of both of those thought paths I think led to policy being this interesting path for us. Or one, it was one that was much less crowded than other parts of philanthropy. And second, we just thought that it had more more leverage. It was more structural, more scalable, more sustainable than kind of annual funding of programs.
What did you find with that idea of you want to focus on policy, other people aren't really looking at it. What did you find as some of the challenges in getting things done?
So there's a lot. So yeah, there's always the question on policy work is, number one, what's the counterfactual, right? And so like something passes and there's a lot of people that take credit for it. And you don't know, without group X, would this still have gotten passed or not? Without your dollars, your contributions into this space, would something have passed or not? So I think that's one. I think policy is a blunt tool, and it can have a lot of unintended consequences. And oftentimes, I think people, when they're trying to address a problem and do it through policy, you can create a new problem by trying to fix something else, right? And systems adjust, and the actors in the systems adjust to any change. And so that kind of led us over time to just be very research focused and trying to figure out, number one, what was the counterfactual, and number two, kind of really think about the unintended consequences and study where these policies or a similar policy had been implemented in a different jurisdiction and try to figure out what impact did it really have.
I'd love to hear about that research focus and maybe using an example. How do you dive into a problem that you're interested in and start using research to try to figure out how you want to pursue solving that problem?
Yeah, I think when we started, my background's in investing, in energy, and I'm going into these new areas for me, education and criminal justice and healthcare and housing, and you just start with reading, right? Reading, everything about the area. I remember when my wife and I kind of first started to get more philanthropic, wanting to write bigger checks, we thought this would be a fairly easy process, and we could just kind of find the 5 kind of highest performing programs and just write some big checks. And I remember going through this pathway of reading about pre-K and all the research on pre-K. And it was almost the more you read, the less you knew, because much of it was contradictory, or you'd read studies and there'd be critiques of those studies, and you'd start scratching your head about what can I actually trust and what are the unknown questions that still exist. And so we started funding a lot of research and tried to do kind of the highest quality research, which is kind of more expensive, it takes more time, but for the amount of resources that society is putting into a lot of these programs, it's worth knowing, are they working or not? And it was pretty clear that those answers weren't there. And so we were just kind of funding a bunch of research and waiting for that to come. But we always thought that the end game of that research was to improve policymaking. Right? And then it became clear, as the research starts coming back, that the research and policymaking communities are just almost two different worlds. Right? And they don't talk to each other very well. And so our role started to shift of becoming that translation function between policymakers and researchers, and almost going backwards. So rather than starting with what do we think are the unanswered questions in this field, like going and talking to policymakers and saying, what are your unanswered questions in the field? What do you want to know? And then trying to either find that research, or if it doesn't exist, go commission it.
I'd love to hear an example of that thread of, in any of the areas that you focused on, learning from policymakers about something they wanted to address, and then taking that and doing research to be able to come back to the policymakers with an answer.
Yeah, so I think there's often ideas about how to address a problem. So one that's very temporal today is about housing and zoning, and how do you increase the amount of housing and densification within certain communities. And there's lots of ideas about what to do. And so it's mostly a state and local issue. And so you see a lot of diversity in housing policy as you go, across states and across cities. And there's natural experiments where a city will enact a policy, call it like 2015, and you can look at the before and after. And if you can kind of find enough of those examples and get enough sample size, you start to get pretty high confidence on that, that you can do this experiment and look at the data and see, what was the impact. And I think there's a number of policies that sound good in theory, and when you enact them, actually nothing happens. Like the system finds a way to kind of ignore that. And there's the counter example where a new policy gets passed, and there's a very strong reaction, right? The actors change their behavior and start building new housing. And so, when we go and talk to like state legislators or mayors, and they're asking us for what are the ideas that actually work. We have these 10, 12 different proposals that are sitting in front of us. We can go look at the research and like what's actually working in cities that are similar to yours, and hopefully they do those rather than the ones that are ineffective.
What do you find is different from something where you have 50 different states who may be having effectively different experiments that you can then look at the results, and then national policy?
Yeah.
And what frictions do you run into at the national level?
So, like, getting anything through Congress is hard, right? That's no secret. The advantage is, if you do something at the federal level, it's just at a much bigger scale, right? Doing state work, you have to go state by state. But in many ways, doing it that way is better because you can do these smaller experiments, right? And there's almost always a state that's struggling with a problem that has the will to go try something different. And they're looking for ideas and want to go do something new. And this federalist system that we have kind of allows that experimentation in the states. And it's also much easier for states to kind of edit and adjust that policy the next year and the next year, because they seldom get it perfectly right in year one. In the federal government, if you get something passed like healthcare reform, it almost takes it off the table for a generation of politicians, right? It's like, okay, we did that, don't want to touch it again, don't want to open it up. And so you have to be really confident in what you're doing at the federal level, because it's going to be hard to edit it in the future, and it's at that scale, kind of that national scale, we don't get that experimentation.
You always get the feeling at the federal level that we, at least currently, live in a very partisan policy making and agendas. What happens when you find something that you feel really works? Like you've done the research, the evidence shows there's a policy, it could be in education, it could be criminal justice, doesn't matter. And then you try to get the voice of Congress to pay attention to something that seems so obvious from the research. Like, what actually happens in your experience through that process?
Yeah, it's interesting that political windows, especially at the federal level, will open and close, and they can close very quickly. And so, one way you can think about it is whenever the window opens, you start doing the work and trying to figure out, okay, what should a policy response in problem X be, right? But that's almost too late because the congressional cycle every 2 years, administrations every 4 years, that you have to be ready with the policy ideas and the evidence behind those before the window opens. And then so whenever it opens, either something's changed or control of Congress or control of the administration changes, and that time presents itself, and you're there with something that's been somewhat baked and has the evidence, has the work behind it, then it's can be somewhat straightforward. But under the rest of the time, unless there's kind of a real demand pull from politicians, people show up in congressional offices every day saying you should do X, you should do Y, and trying to kind of come up above that fray can be hard. I think where we're a little bit different is most people who show up in congressional offices are asking for more resources, right? Like everybody says, like, you need more money for this, more money for that, more money for that. And we come at this with kind of a different philosophy of how do you improve the systems without just putting more resources into it, right? Because money's, budgets are tight, especially at the state and local level. Anything that spends more money is just hard to do in general. And so if we have ideas about how to improve the system without spending more money, there's just much more interest and demand for that.
What's an example of something you've done that really worked following that framework?
So we're working a lot on energy permitting reform today. It's gotten increasingly hard to build any type of linear infrastructure in this country, whether that's transportation or rail or highways, and then particularly on energy infrastructure. And so it's a problem that's really come into being in the past several years. We've seen kind of consecutive presidencies now where the president has favored energy sources and disfavored energy sources. And the energy sector is one where you need robust supply chains and you need long-term planning. Developers need to have confidence that when they invest $1, that their project's not going to be halted, halfway through because of a change of administration. And so there's actually a lot of bipartisan interest in this about how do you make sure that objections to projects are heard, but they're heard in a relatively quick time frame so that the good projects can get started and that developers have confidence that once they have their permits that they can go build and that it's not going to get tied up in courts for years and years. And so this is one where there's no fiscal cost to do permitting reform. And it solves a problem that's really affecting Americans, right, with rising costs of electricity. And so we're seeing a lot of demand for that and have relatively good optimism that something will get done later this year.
What is it that leads you to focus in certain areas? You wouldn't think of permitting reform necessarily, other than your investing background, as an area that would come to focus. Pre-K, education, because you happen to see a charity, some of the other areas. Where do you decide where to dive in?
So I think we're somewhat unique in that we're non-ideological, non-partisan in our work. And so in DC, in the policy spaces, there's a lot of partisan shops. There's a lot of partisan advocacy. And so we're looking for areas where there is bipartisan will. That's really where we see our space. Like it has to start with people from both sides of the aisle identify a problem and want to do something. And then we help to figure out, okay, then what? And so I think we really start there, and and so is an issue bipartisan? Are there ideas that the field has that can be tested or developed? There's a number of areas where you can think of a problem, but the field's scratching their head about what to do about it. Everybody's kind of wondering about what's the effect of AI on jobs in the future, and everybody I talk to is kind of scratching their head because they can't even really define what the problem is today. But so there have to be the ideas, there has to be kind of this bipartisan interest, and there has to be kind of a political viability of it. And then I think the fourth factor is we get drawn to issues where there's a lot of green space for us. So there are some areas where a lot of other people are working, and that's great. But I think we have lower additionality in that space than if we go into one where there's not many actors working in it.
So one of the newer ones you've been spending some time on is sports betting.
Yeah.
Would love to hear that thread and where you are today.
Yeah, so Just brief history, in 1992, federal government passes a law that bans states from legalizing online sports betting. And notwithstanding that, in 2012, New Jersey put it to their voters about whether to legalize it, and the voters said yes. And it started a 6-year journey through the courts, and in 2018, Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not ban states from banning sports betting. And so there was kind of a mad rush from some states. New Jersey started almost immediately. And as of today, there's 32 states where it's been legalized. And I think that, what we're looking at is there's starting to be kind of the visibility of some of the repercussions of that. And there's the problem gambling that's associated with it. And we've gotten concerned that this rush to pass these laws was largely thinking about the previous generation of gambling. And so this is the first time where you've had a low friction and high speed of play of gambling. If you think about it, you can have high friction, high speed of play. Think about slot machines in Vegas, right? You can every 5 or 10 seconds you can pull the arm, but there's friction to get there, right? You get on a plane, get in a car, right? There's a lot of friction to actually go play. Or you can think about something that's low friction, low speed of play. Think about the Super Bowl squares game where you put your name down, give $20, and then you get 8 and 4, and if the Seahawks win 28-14, you win, right? Easy, low friction on that, but the speed of play, you put your money down, you find out in 3 days whether you won or not. So this is the first time we've had kind of low friction, right? You just pull out your phone, and very high speed of play, right? And the gaming companies have realized they don't want you putting down $10 and waiting 4 hours to see who won the football game. They want you betting on every play. And so there's odds on every play, every quarter, every prop imaginable about this player does X, Y, and Z. And so this is an entirely different type of gambling, type of gaming. And I think we're hearing from a number of state legislators who are scratching their heads saying, we jumped in this pool too early. And so we're doing a couple things. Number one, we're funding a lot of research on what the real ramifications of gambling are, of this online sports gambling. What are design features around it that can try to minimize problematic gambling? And I think we start with the premise that most people can gamble responsibly, that it brings joy and interest and entertainment for many people. And so not looking to ban it, but how do you minimize the harms along with it? And then just asking state legislators to slow down, right? And think about what the pros of legalizing it are, but also what the negatives are, and whether it makes sense for your community to do so. And then we have this whole prediction markets thing, which is a huge chaos into the policy making, but that's a different story.
What have you found in your initial research?
So we just started commissioning research in the past couple months. I think there's been some research to date that was done by others. And I think there's a number of concerning trends. There's the demographic who's most affected is young men and boys, and it's a demographic that's having probably the most challenges in life today as well. If you look at kind of who gets involved in the criminal justice system, it's young men and boys. Who gets the lowest grades in general? It's boys. Richard Reeves set up this American Institute for Boys and Men, kind of looking at all these factors and saying that not that we need to favor boys over girls, but that boys have their unique set of challenges, and they need some focus too. And so, I think you go through my son's high school, and somehow most of these kids who are 15 to 18 years old have a sports betting account that they've gotten access to somehow. And gambling in the States is generally 21 and up. And now we've got this pathway to suck in a lot of teenage boys into it. And it's very concerning. And there's a number of studies that show kind of increase in financial negative ramifications for society broader.
As you take a step back from all the work you've done in philanthropy, what are some of the most important lessons you've learned that you might advise somebody else that you didn't know when you set on this journey?
So it's hard, right? It takes time. It's a path that I think you're always learning on. I think understanding kind of what your goals are really important. Trying to focus as much as possible makes it a little bit easier. You can try to become expert, or at least have passing expertise in a single area, and try to meet as many people as you can in that area. And then I'd say oftentimes time is as or more important than money for some organizations. There's many people who, the do-gooders in the world, who start in these nonprofits, they sometimes can find themselves as head of a large organization, right? And they just need help running a business, right? It becomes a business, and having more wise voices around the table is always valuable.
What are Laura and you most excited about over the next couple of years in the work you're doing?
Yeah, we started this line of work a couple of years ago around infrastructure. So it's energy, housing, transportation. And that's really become kind of front and center in the political debates. And this whole issue of affordability and about how can the government respond to the needs of their community, especially whenever budgets are very tight in many cities and states. And so this kind of, I feel like we have predicted this move and this demand pull from policymakers on the affordability issues, and we've kind of been front and center of it.
So I have one more question I want to ask you, which is, what's the most surprising insight that you've gotten from all of your work in philanthropy?
So people's baseline is very strong. And so doing interventions at the individual level, you can often kind of get somebody who's here and kind of short-term bringing them up and improve their life in the short term. And most interventions then kind of fade back to baseline. And I think this is one of the things we've seen in research, and a lot of research that gets funded on kind of program evaluations, is that all they look at is what's the short-term effect. Did this person get a job when they went through job training? And they kind of stop there, and you hear 90% of the graduates of our program got a job within 3 months, and you say, that's great. And then if you follow those people and compare them against kind of a like set that had not gone through the program, very frequently you see what looks like this very significant improvement just start to whittle down and kind of go back to zero. And it's disappointing in a way and very humbling in the work.
Yeah. And what have you tried to do to address that?
So some of this is kind of going more towards the policy work, right? Changing the rules and incentives of systems rather than kind of a one-shot programmatic intervention. And then the second is kind of what I spoke about earlier, that whenever we're funding research, that we want to fund the long-term effect and not just what happened in 1 month or 3 months, but what happened in 3 years. Did it really improve lives, or was it just this temporary improvement?
Well, John, thanks so much for sharing your insight, and most importantly, thanks so much for the work Laura and you are doing for the world.
Thank you.